Hey, Osyka Youth Group, Brother Reed here. This is Wednesday night's message for May the 6th. We're continuing on in the book of Romans. I hope everybody's been having a good week so far and enjoying this beautiful weather that we've been having. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and get started. This is we're finishing up chapter 11, starting in verse 11. And guys, I just want you to listen and pay attention to what's said here, not by me but by God's word, because it really shows His faithfulness and His kindness, and it even talks about kindness there, but His love and patience and forgiveness and all those characteristics that we always talk about God having, and that's what this end part really talks about. So I just want you to see that. So we're going to start on in verse 11 of chapter 11 in Romans. It says, "I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their transgression salvation has come to the Gentiles, to make them jealous. Now if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also, and if the root is holy, the branches are too. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in? Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, He will not spare you either. Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fail, severity, but to you God's kindness. If you continue in kindness, otherwise you will also be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed about this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers, for the gifts and the callings of God are irrevocable. For just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may now be shown mercy. For God has shut up all the disobedience so that He may show mercy to all. Oh, the depth of the riches both of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are His judgments, and unfathomable His ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became His counselor, or who has first given to Him that it might be paid back to Him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. So hopefully you saw that in there, his patience with Israel, and how he, because of their unbelief and disobedience, he's turned away from them and turned to the Gentiles, the non-chosen, I guess you would say, because Israel was his chosen people. But because of their disobedience, he sees this other group of people, and he has mercy on them. And because he has mercy on them, it says that it will drive them to jealousy, because they've been getting everything, they had pretty much anything and everything they wanted, in a sense, God's favor upon them. But because they pretty much just abused it, God starts showing favoritism to someone else, and that in a way gets their attention. And if you think about that in our terms of, boyfriend and girlfriend, or just friends, if somebody's abusing the friendship, and you just kind of say, well, fine, if you're not going to be a friend, I'll start hanging around with someone else, another friend, then usually that'll get their attention, when they see that you start talking to someone else, or you start hanging around someone else, that'll usually get their attention. Now, sometimes their reaction to that can go different ways. Sometimes they get mad and they try to attack the one that is being shown the attention, and sometimes they get mad at the one that is showing the attention. And we see that, in this situation with Israel and the Gentiles, is a lot of times they would get more upset with the Gentiles instead of making amends with God. And that happens today too. If God starts using someone, he's trying to use you. Just play along here, this little thing. He's trying to use you, but you don't want to be used, or whatever. You just want to be in your comfort zone. So he starts using someone else, and you're like, well, man, I wish God would use me like that. And then you have the choice of either getting right with God, or as some do, some people will, they'll get right with God, and then God starts using them. But then some people want to attack the one that God is using, and try to, steal their spotlight or whatever, trying to make them look bad and all this kind of stuff, when they before that, they were okay with everything. And I mean, I've seen that firsthand many times. But anyway, that's what's going on here. Is Paul is showing them how God's favoritism, or whatever you want to call that, provision, mercy, grace, all that has shifted from his chosen people over to someone else because of what Israel was doing. They were taking it for granted. They were turning away from God. And guys, I mean, there's danger in, if God's showing you favor, you need to continue in the direction you're going. If you turn from that, then that favor goes away, because he says that, and you can read back in all throughout the Old Testament where God was using Israel and providing for them and all this kind of stuff, and then they would turn and serve other gods, and God would just, he would take his hand of protection and all that away from them, and then they would go into captivity and be abused by whoever was holding them captive, and then they would come to their senses and cry out to God, and then He would put His hand of mercy on them again and lead them out like He did with Moses out of Egypt. But then we also see, as soon as they got out of that situation, then their focus turned off of God and they started doing their own thing again. So all of that in the Old Testament is to try to get our attention and try to keep us from following in that same footprint, or whatever you want to call it. That saying of those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat history. And that's the thing. That's why we have the Bible, to show us what history was and how we can avoid those situations. But it goes on, and it kind of shifts to the one that's being shown this mercy, the Gentile. And it says, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. So if God starts using you, and God starts showing favor on you, God starts showing mercy on you, don't get all swelled up in the head, because listen, it's nothing you've done. Like we saw in the previous chapters, God will have mercy on whom He has mercy. He has chosen to show mercy on people just because in some situations, and then some situations is to wake up the people around you and show that God is still at work in people, and He still uses people for His glory and to further His kingdom. It goes on, it says, you will say then, branches are broken off so that I may be grafted in. Quite right, he says. They were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear, for if God did not spare the natural branches, He will not spare you either. So if God starts to change His using people in ministry, or just blessing someone, He starts, you see people being blessed, okay, and then all of a sudden they start having hard times, and you start to be blessed. Paul's reminding, hey, don't let your head fill up with pride and all that, because it's nothing you've done. It's God doing all this. And just like He took that hand of mercy off of them, He can take it off of you too. So you need to stay obedient to Him, and stay focused on Him, and continue to give Him all the honor and praise and glory He deserves. It goes on, it says, but then the kindness and severity of God to those who fail, severity, but to you God's kindness, if you continue in His kindness, otherwise you'll be cut off. So that's that other side of God. He has kindness, and then He has severity. He has kindness and then He has wrath, and that's what it's reminding the people about, is He shows that severity to the ones He cut off, and He cuts them off because of their unbelief and their unfaithfulness, and He puts out the kindness to the Gentile. But it says, but to you God's kindness, if you continue in His kindness, otherwise you'll be cut off. So that's that thing, if God is showing you mercy, and God is showing you grace, and God is showing you love and provision, and all those things, continue in the path that caused Him, in a sense, to do that. If he's He's pouring that out for reasons. Sometimes it's to get your attention. Sometimes it's just to bless you because you've been blessing other people. But you need to check your life and see if there's something that you're doing right, and that's why God is blessing you. Well, don't stop. And that's what Israel had done, was they had been blessed and they had been provided for, and they've been taken care of, and all those things. And then they would turn their focus off, like I said a while ago. It says, continue in his kindness, otherwise you'll be cut off. But then it goes on, it says, and they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted back in. So that's what I wanted y'all to see in there, is even though Israel had fallen, even though Israel had turned away from God, he was still there with that stretched out hand, like we saw in the previous chapters. It says that he stood there. Let's see. Let's further back than that. Thought I had it highlighted. Maybe not. But with stretched out hands day and night, waiting for them to turn back to him, in a sense. So just like if you're shown kindness by God, continue in that kindness, otherwise you'll be cut off. And it says, and they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who were the natural branches be grafted into their own natural tree? So it's just common sense that this is God's chosen people, and if they're cast out because of their unbelief and their unfaithfulness and their disobedience and all that kind of stuff, and someone else is allowed in, just like they were allowed in, that those that have been kicked out will definitely be allowed back in if they turn. And like I say, this is late in the Bible, Old Testament. You see it over and over and over, and every time that God's people humble themselves and turn from their wicked ways and call out to him and ask for forgiveness, he is there with open arms, like the prodigal son and the father there, willing to forgive and allow them to come back in. It goes on, it says, for I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will remove the ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So, I mean, that's God's faithfulness. That's God's mercy and grace and love, that he is willing to forgive them and draw them back into the covenant that he made with them, the promises that he has made with them. It says, from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may now be shown mercy. For God has shut up all in disobedience, so that he may show mercy to all. There's verses and verses in the Bible. If you go and look, you'll find verses where like the one, I'll show mercy on whom I show mercy, There's ones that God takes credit for things that we wouldn't think that God would do. Uh, it says there's one where I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but it talks about uh, causing calamity and causing good things, and he says, I'm the God who does both. And a lot of people don't want to think about that. They think of God as just all the good stuff that ever happens to you is God, and anything bad is Satan. But there's quite a few verses in the Bible where God takes credit for both of them, and we see that where He talks about pouring out His wrath in Revelation, and we see that in the Old Testament dealing with Israel, how He would do things to wake them up, shake them to the core, cause them to kneel, and cause them to repent and turn from their wicked ways. It's kind of like a parent, if a child is disobeying, a child's not doing right and not doing what they're told, first comes the voice of saying, that's not right, you need to do this, and then it gets more stern and more consequences, and that's what God, that's the way He operates. He's no different. If you disobey Him, He will, as the old saying, take you to the woodshed and straighten you out, take you around back and get the paddle out and tear your butt up if He needs to. Whatever He needs to do to get you on the right path, God will do. So, and that is because of His love. Because, guys, He is willing to endure all of this. He is willing to, all this, the branches and stuff. He's willing to graft them back in. He cut them off, but He's willing to graft them back in because He loves them. It says, in verse 33, it says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are His judgments and unfathomable His ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became His counselor, or who has first given to Him that it might be paid back to Him again? For from Him and through Him and to Him are all things. To Him be glory forever. Amen." You start talking about God's wrath and God's cutting off the branches of Israel and all that, and people, if you talk about a lot of that, people will start thinking that God is just mean and all this kind of stuff. But when you read and you really look at it, then you'll see God's mercy in all this. And that's what Paul ends that chapter with. It says, to Him be the glory forever. God deserves all the honor, praise, and glory that all of us could ever put forth to Him, and more than that. So even with His judgments, it says, how unsearchable are His judgments and unfathomable His ways. But oh, the depth of the riches, both the wisdom and knowledge of God. Looking at this stuff, people will say, well, I'll do it this way, or there's got to be a better way. But what does Paul say? It says, the depth of the riches, both the wisdom and knowledge of God. There's no comparison, guys. He knows everything. He's and that one there, it says in 34, it says, or who became His counselor. There's a preacher, guys, that he's from Louisiana, and he's a televangelist, and there's a sermon what he gets to talking about how God asked him for his opinion of what God needed to do. It's like God saying, hey, what should I do about this, or what should I do about that? And you read that, and it's like, really? Paul says, who became his counselor? Nobody became God's counselor. God don't ask for your opinion. God doesn't ask for your okay. He doesn't ask anything. Your say so. He don't need none of that. And I've heard people talk about that our prayers allow God to do things. No, that's not the way it works, guys. God don't need our okay to do anything. He spoke everything into existence. He didn't need us to say, hey, you should make the waters look like this, or you should make the land look like that. So he don't need anything from us. He don't need our praise and glory. I mean, he don't need any of that. He don't need anything from us. But he chooses to use us. He chooses to love us. He chooses to provide for us and take care of us. He chooses to. And that's what I think Paul is trying to get across to these people, is he don't have to do any of that. He will show mercy on whom he shows mercy. He don't have to show mercy on anybody, but he chooses to. So guys, that's what we should be encouraged by, that God chooses to love us. While we were yet sinners, he loved us. When we were the worst of the worst, something, I don't know what it was, that he saw in each one of us and says, I love that. I think it was more of not what we were, but he saw what we were created to be and what we could be if we were set on the right path and had the right counsel, and we had the right motivation and all those things, and had the right thoughts. We had the right desires. So guys, I hope this encourages you with the love that's shown there, the mercy and that God has for each and every one of us. And hope everybody's staying safe, and we will see you on the next video on Sunday. See you guys.